In the autumn of 1887, in the high red country of the Arizona Territory, a woman named Clara Mercer paid $2 for the right to drag a rusted iron lockbox out of a dry canyon that everyone in the town of Salt Fork had already decided was empty. She was 28 years old, and she had buried her father 6 weeks before. The box weighed more than she did. It had sat wedged in a cleft of sandstone above the old freight road for the better part of 30 years, and the men who had looked at it had all reached the same conclusion, which was that anything worth carrying out of that canyon had been carried out long ago. They were wrong about the box, and they were wrong about her, and the story of how both wrongs were set right is the kind that deserves to be told slowly, the way her father would have wanted it told. She had come into Salt Fork on foot, leading a single mule named Pim, because the wagon had been sold to pay the doctor, and the doctor had not been able to do anything anyway. What she owned in the world fit in 2 canvas sacks and a wooden chest of her father's tools. The tools were the reason she had come. A man at the assay office had told her that the county was selling off the unclaimed contents of the old Hollis freight line, the wrecks and the abandoned cargo that had sat in the canyon since the line failed in the war years, and that a person with a strong back and low expectations might find something there. Clara had a strong back. Her expectations she kept to herself. Stay with me, because the thing she found in that box is the reason a banker 3 counties over stopped sleeping. That comes later, though. First, you must understand what kind of woman would pay good money for an iron box she could not lift. Her father had been a locksmith and a safe man, the sort the railroads and the mining companies hired when a strongbox jammed, or a vault forgot its own combination, or a mechanism rusted shut in a flood. Tobias Mercer had hands that could read a lock the way other men read a letter. He had taught Clara from the time she was old enough to hold a pick, not because he expected the world to let a woman do the work, but because he could not help teaching what he loved and because she was the only child he had. By the time she was 20, she could open most things her father could open. By the time he died, she could open all of them, though she had never told him so, because it would have sounded like boasting, and he had no use for boasting. A lock is only a question, he used to say. The trouble is, most people ask it rudely. He meant that force was the enemy of the work. A pick was a conversation, a drill was a last resort and an admission of failure. He had owned 1 set of fine picks that had come from a maker in St. Louis, slender steel and a roll of oiled leather, and those picks were in the wooden chest now, along with a small brass tension wrench worn smooth by his thumb. They were the most valuable thing Clara carried, and they were worth nothing at all to anyone but her. The county sale was held in the yard behind the Hollis depot, which had not seen a working train since before Clara was born. A clerk read the lots from a ledger in a flat voice while a thin crowd of men poked at the merchandise. There were wheel hubs and broken harness and a stove with its door missing. There was a heap of iron that had once been a handcar. And there was, the clerk said, 1 strongbox, contents unknown, condition poor, currently lodged in the canyon above the 7th milepost and not removed, sold as it lies, the buyer to bear the cost of recovery. The men laughed at that lot before anyone had even bid. One of them, a freighter named Del Cargill, with a red face and a way of standing as though the ground owed him an apology, said loud enough for the yard to hear that he had seen the box himself, that it had no key and no handle left and was rusted to the rock, and that whoever bought it was buying the privilege of a hernia. The clerk asked for an opening bid. Nobody spoke. The clerk asked again. Clara said $2. The yard turned to look at her, and she let them look. She had learned long ago that a woman who flinched under a crowd's eyes invited the crowd to keep staring, and a woman who did not flinch made them find something else to do. Del Cargill found something to say instead. He asked her whether she planned to carry it out in her apron. A few men laughed. The clerk, who had a sale to finish and no opinion about her apron, wrote her name in the ledger, and took her $2 and told her the box was hers, rock and rust and all, and that the county wished her joy of it. She did not answer Cargill. She folded the receipt and put it in the chest with her father's picks, and that small act of putting the paper where the picks were is the first thread of this story, so hold on to it. What none of them knew, because she had told no one, was that Clara had not come to Salt Fork blindly among her father's papers. In the weeks of sorting that follow a death, she had found a letter. It was old, the ink browned, the fold lines soft as cloth. It was from a man named Amos Wend, written in 1858, and it had been addressed to her father at a shop in Missouri that her father had kept before he ever came west. The letter asked Tobias Mercer to come to the Arizona Territory and open a box. It said the box belonged to the Hollis Freight Company and that something had been put inside it that should not have been, and that the man who had put it there was dead, and the man who wanted it, kept hidden, was not. It offered a sum of money that, even browned with age, made Clara sit down. And it was never answered because folded inside it was a second letter, this one in her father's hand, never sent, that began, "I cannot come, my wife is dying, and I will not leave her," and ended, "God keep the box shut until an honest hand can open it." Her mother had died in the spring of 1858. Clara had been an infant. Her father had stayed, and the box had stayed shut, and Amos Wend had presumably died waiting, and for 30 years the thing had sat in the canyon, while the people who might have cared forgot to. Clara had read the letter 4 times. Then she had packed the chest of tools, sold the wagon, and walked west to open a box her father had promised an honest hand would open someday. She did not know what was in it. She only knew that her father had thought it mattered enough to refuse a fortune over, and that he had kept the letter for 30 years rather than burn it, and that meant the promise was hers now, the way the picks were hers. The canyon above the 7th milepost was a 40-minute walk from the depot, and she made it the next morning with Pim hauling a borrowed sledge and a coil of rope, and a jack she had paid another $2 to rent. The old freight road ran along the canyon floor between walls of red sandstone that turned gold where the morning light struck them. Sage grew in the dry bed. A hawk worked the updraft overhead. And there, perhaps 15 feet up the western wall, wedged into a cleft as though the rock had grown around it, was the box. It was bigger than she had let herself imagine. Iron, banded, the size of a small trunk, the kind of strong box a freight company bolted to the bed of a wagon for the carriage of payroll and bullion and papers that mattered. Time had welded it to the stone with rust the color of dried blood. The lid was a single slab with a recessed lock plate, and the lock, she could see even from below, was a good one, a lever lock of the better kind, the kind her father had taught her to respect. She stood and looked at it for a long while. This is the moment, if you have ever been told that a thing you wanted was not worth wanting, that you might recognize she did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of the work ahead and the quieter weight of the promise behind it. Getting it down took 3 days. She did not try to muscle it. Force was the enemy of the work, in stone as in steel. The first day she cleared the cleft, chipping away the sandstone that had crumbled over the box's lower edge, freeing the iron from the rock, grain by grain, with a cold chisel and a 4-pound hammer, working in the cool of the morning and resting in the shade through the worst of the heat. The sandstone came away in flakes, the color of rust, and in a fine red powder that worked into the creases of her knuckles and would not wash out for a week. She learned the box by touch, as she worked, the banded iron, the bolt heads where it had once been fixed to a wagon bed, the lower corner that had taken the brunt of 30 winters and bled long stains down the rock beneath it. By mid-afternoon her hands had blistered and the blisters had broken, and she had wrapped them in strips torn from a flour sack and gone on, because a day lost to sore hands was a day the canyon kept the box, and she had not come this far to let it. The second day she rigged the rope through a sling around the box and around a boulder above, and used the jack and her own weight and Pim's slow strength to ease it out of the cleft an inch at a time, so that it slid rather than fell, because a fall of 15 feet onto rock might have sprung the lid and bent the lock plate and ruined whatever waited inside. It was the kind of work that looked like nothing and cost everything. She would set the jack, gain half an inch, chock the box with a wedge of mesquite so it could not slide back, reset the jack, and gain half an inch more. The sun crossed the canyon. Pim stood patient in the traces and leaned when she clicked her tongue and stopped when she said so. And between them, the woman and the mule, they moved a thing that 4 laughing men in a depot yard had agreed could not be moved by anyone with sense. On the third day she lowered it the last of the way and let it down onto a bed of brush she had cut and piled, and it settled there with a sound like a closing door, and she sat down beside it in the red dust, and did not move for a quarter of an hour. Her shoulders had locked, her wrapped hands had stiffened around the shape of the rope. She did not feel that she had won anything yet. She felt only that the first lock, the lock of stone and gravity, had finally given, and that the second and harder lock was still ahead of her under its lid of rust. A boy had been watching from the road since the second day. He came closer now. He was perhaps 10, barefoot, the son of a woman who took in washing at the edge of town, and his name was Eli. He asked her if there was gold in it. She told him she did not know. He asked her how she would find out. She told him she would ask it politely. He thought about that and decided it was the strangest thing a grown person had ever said to him, and he stayed to watch, and he was there for the part that mattered, which is good, because a thing seen by only one person is too easily called a lie. Ward came down the road the way word does. By the time Clara had Pim haul the box the last mile to the lean-to she had rented behind the washing woman's house, half of Salt Fork had heard that the apron woman had got her box out of the canyon after all, and a fair number of them found reasons to walk past and look. Del Cargill came too. He stood at the edge of the yard with his thumbs in his belt and said it was a lot of work for an empty box, and that everyone knew the Hollis line had been robbed clean in the war, and that she would open it to find rats and rust and the joke would be on her. Clara said that might be so. She had learned that agreeing with a man like Cargill cost nothing and ended the conversation faster than arguing. She did not open it that day, and that restraint is worth noticing. She could have done it within the hour. The crowd wanted her to. A part of her wanted to. Instead, she covered the box with a tarp and let the crowd go home because she did not yet know what was inside, and her father's voice was in her ear telling her that a lock asked in front of an audience is a lock asked rudely, and because some part of her understood without being able to say it. That whatever Amos Wend had been afraid of 30 years ago might still have teeth. That night, by lamplight, with only the boy Eli for company, because he had refused to go home, she knelt at the box and asked it her question. She cleaned the lock plate first, working penetrating oil into the keyway with a feather, then a fine wire, clearing 30 years of rust and grit and the corpses of insects. She tapped the lid along its seams to learn where the rust had frozen it and where it had not. Then she unrolled the leather and took out her father's picks, and she chose the slender one with the slight upturn at the tip that he had called the patient pick, and she set the brass tension wrench in the keyway and felt for the first lever with the pick. The way he had taught her, her eyes closed, reading the lock through her fingers. It took her 2 hours. The lock had 5 levers, and the rust had stiffened all of them, and twice she had to stop and oil it again and wait, and once Eli fell asleep against the wall and woke, when the 4th lever gave, with a sound like a knuckle cracking. She did not hurry. Hurry was force, and force was the enemy. The first lever lifted clean within the quarter hour, and she let herself believe the rest would follow. And the rest did not, because the second lever was seized hard against its spring and would not rise, no matter how she coaxed it. She drew the pick out, oiled the keyway again, and sat back on her heels and waited for the oil to do its slow work the way her father had taught her to wait, doing nothing, while the boy watched her do nothing and could not understand how doing nothing was part of the work. When she went back in, the second lever rose. The third came after it. She learned the lock as she went, the depth of each lever, the particular grit of this maker's springs, the way the whole mechanism breathed a little when she found the right tension, and she understood, somewhere in the middle of those 2 hours, that she was reading a thing her father might have read, that the maker in St. Louis, who had ground his picks, might well have known the maker who had built this lock, that she was holding a conversation 30 years old between dead men, and that she was the only living person who could hear it. On the fifth lever, well past midnight, she felt the bolt begin to draw, and she eased the tension and let the mechanism do what it had been built to do, and the bolt slid back, and the lock was open. She did not lift the lid right away. She knelt there with her hand flat on the cold iron and breathed. Then she opened it. The first thing was the smell, the dry mineral smell of air that had been shut away from the world for 30 years, suddenly let out. The lamplight fell into the box. Eli leaned over her shoulder. And Clara Mercer, who had not wept at her father's grave because there had been too much to do, went silent in a way that the boy would remember for the rest of his life. A silence so complete that he grew frightened and asked her what was wrong, and she did not answer because she was reading. The box was not full of gold. There was a little money in it, a leather sack of gold coin that would prove to be a fair sum, but not a fortune. The fortune, if you can call it that, was paper. The box was packed with documents tied in bundles with faded ribbon, dry and intact, the cold air of the canyon having kept them as well as any archive. And on top of the bundles, weighted under the coin sack so it would be the first thing an honest hand found, was a letter in the same hand as the one Clara carried, the hand of Amos Wend, and it was addressed not to her father but to whoever opens this. She read it twice before she spoke. Then she told Eli to go home and sleep, and for once he went, because the look on her face was not a look a boy argues with. What Amos Wend had written, and what the bundled documents proved, was this. Amos Wend had been the bookkeeper of the Hollis Freight Company. In the war years, when the territory was in chaos and the line was failing, a man named Josiah Pruitt had bought up the company's debts and its routes and its land grants for a fraction of their worth, and he had done it by means of a fraud that Wend, as bookkeeper, had been ordered to help conceal. Pruitt had forged the signatures of the freight line's original investors, small ranchers and shopkeepers and a few freed men who had put their savings into the company, onto documents that surrendered their shares for nothing. Those people had believed they were ruined by the war. In truth, they had been robbed by a pen. Pruitt had taken their land and their shares and built them into a banking house, and he had let the world believe the Hollis line had simply died. Amos Wend had kept the proof. The real ledgers, the genuine signatures, the correspondence in which Pruitt instructed the forgeries, the original share certificates that the robbed investors had never knowingly surrendered. Wend had been too afraid to use them while Pruitt had power, and too honest to destroy them, so he had locked them in the company's strong box, written to the one honest locksmith he had ever known. And when that man could not come, Wend had hidden the box in the canyon and let the rumor spread that the line had been robbed clean, so that no one would think to look. Then he had died, and the secret had died with him, and Josiah Pruitt had grown old and rich and respectable 3 counties away in the town of Bell Crossing, where his bank held the mortgages of half the territory. Clara sat with the papers until dawn. She was not thinking about the gold. She was thinking about the names. Because the share certificates listed them, the robbed investors, and besides several of the names Wend had written, in his careful bookkeeper's hand, what had become of them? Most were dead. Not all of them, though. And one name, a freed man named Caleb Foss, who had put $40 and his free papers worth of hope into the Hollis line in 1859, was followed by a note that said, "His daughter lives yet, at Salt Fork, takes in washing." The washing woman, Eli's mother. The boy who had stayed to watch had been the great-grandson of a man Josiah Pruitt had robbed, and the box that the boy had asked about gold had been in part his family's stolen inheritance, and none of them had known, and the proof had been sitting in a canyon above their heads the whole of the boy's life. This is the place in the story where a different kind of woman might have done a different kind of thing. She might have taken the gold and gone. She might have gone to Bell Crossing and confronted Josiah Pruitt and demanded he pay. She might have sold the papers to Pruitt himself, who would surely have paid a great deal to see them burn. Clara did none of these. She had been raised by a man who believed that the work was a conversation and that force was an admission of failure, and she understood, sitting in the gray light with 30 years of stolen names in her lap, that the way to undo a wrong done by a pen was not a gun, and not a fist, and not even a shout. It was the truth, set down plainly, put where it could not be ignored. She spent a week reading every document in the box and copying the essential ones in her own hand so that there would be more than one record. She learned the law of the territory as it touched fraud and land title. Sitting in the back of the county recorder's office reading statutes, she only half understood, and asking the recorder, an elderly man named Hubbard who had been in the territory long enough to remember the Hollis line, the question she could not answer alone. Hubbard was the first person besides Eli she trusted with any part of it, and she trusted him because he was old and tired and had no stake left in pleasing anyone, and because when she said the name Pruitt, his face changed in a way that told her he had wondered about that man for years. It was Hubbard who told her what she most needed to know, which was that the robbed investors, or their living heirs, could bring a claim to set aside a fraudulent conveyance even after many years, if the fraud could be proven by clear evidence, and that the territory had a court that would hear it, and that the great difficulty in such cases was always the evidence which the guilty had usually long since destroyed. He said it sitting at his high recorder's desk with the afternoon light coming sideways through the dusty window, an old man with ink on his fingers, and a stoop from 40 years of bending over other people's business. He looked at the bundle she had brought him, the genuine ledgers and the forged conveyances, side by side, and the letters in which Pruitt ordered the forging, and he was quiet for a while. He turned the pages slowly, the way a man turns the pages of a book he already knows is going to break his heart. Then he said that in 40 years of recording the territory's business he had never seen a fraud so completely documented by the man who committed it, and that Josiah Pruitt had made the single mistake that proud men make, which was to keep records of his own cleverness. He told her, too, that she would be fought, that a bank had lawyers the way a fort had walls, and that they would try first to frighten her, and then to discredit her, and that she must let neither work. Clara said she had been frightened and discredited by experts, meaning the men in the depot yard, and that it had not opened a single lock for them yet. The old recorder laughed, the first laugh she had heard from him, and said that he believed her, and that he was in it with her now whether she liked it or not, because a man did not get to the end of a long honest life and turn away from the one true thing that ever walked into his office. What happened over the following months is not the stuff of a single dramatic scene, and Clara would have been the first to say so. It was slow work, the kind of work she understood. With Hubbard's help she found the living heirs of the robbed investors, one by one, the way she had eased the box from the rock an inch at a time. There were 11 of them scattered across the territory and beyond, a blacksmith's widow, 2 brothers running a hardscrabble ranch, a schoolteacher, a freedman's daughter who took in washing at Salt Fork, and her son Eli. Clara wrote to each of them plainly with a copy of the proof of what they were owed, and she asked nothing for herself. Some did not believe her. The blacksmith's widow, a hard woman named Ada Cruz, who had been cheated by enough men to expect it from everyone, wrote back that she had no money for lawyers and no patience for false hope, and that if this was some new swindle, Clara could keep it. So, Clara wrote again, more plainly still, and enclosed a copy of the share certificate with Ada's late husband's true signature on it beside the forged surrender in another hand, and asked only that Ada bring both to any honest man who had known her husband's writing, and let him judge. Ada brought them to the parson who had married her. The parson looked a long time and then took off his spectacles and said that he had buried an honest man and that this paper here was a lie, told over an honest man's name, and Ada Cruz sat down in the parson's parlor and did not speak for a while, and then she wrote to Clara that she would come. The two brothers, who ran cattle on land they had always believed they merely rented, rode 3 days to Salt Fork to look at the proof with their own eyes, because a thing that large could not be trusted to a letter. They were young men, suspicious and tired, and they stood in Clara's lean-to, turning the old ledgers in their rough hands as though the paper might bite. The elder of them found his grandfather's name in Wen's column of the robbed, and read it twice, and asked Clara, in a voice gone careful, whether this meant the land was theirs. She told him it meant the land had always been theirs, and that the law had a way of saying so out loud, and that she would help them ask the law the question if they were willing to wait for a slow answer. They were willing. Men who work hard land learn patience, or they do not last, and these two had lasted. The washing woman was the last Clara told, and the hardest, because by then Clara knew the boy. Her name was Pearl Foss, and she was Caleb Foss's granddaughter, and she had taken in the territory's dirty linen for 20 years, with her hands cracked from lie and her back bent over a washboard. And she had never once been told that her family had owned a piece of a freight line, because the man who took it had been careful to leave the robbed, believing they had simply been poor. Clara sat at Pearl's table and laid the certificate down, and told the story plainly. The $40, the hope, the forged surrender, the box in the canyon, and Pearl Foss listened with her cracked hands flat on the table, and when Clara finished, Pearl looked over at Eli, asleep in the corner, and asked the only question that mattered to her, which was whether this meant the boy could go to school. Clara said she believed it did. Pearl Foss put her face in her hands, then, not weeping, only pressing, as though to hold something in, and that was the moment more than the open box, more than the court, that told Clara the work had been worth doing. She did go to Bell Crossing once, not to confront Josiah Pruitt, but to see him the way you look at a lock before you decide how to open it. It was a 2-day ride, and she made it alone, and she told no one in Salt Fork where she had gone. Bell Crossing was a prosperous town, brick where Salt Fork was board, with a wide main street and a stone bank at the head of it, and the bank was the handsomest building she had seen since leaving Missouri. She sat across the street from it on a bench outside a feed store, a plain woman with a satchel that no one looked at twice, and she watched. She watched the clerks come and go. She watched a farmer turned away at the door and a cattleman ushered in. And near the middle of the day she watched an old man in a good gray coat come out, attended by a younger clerk who held his elbow, an old man who moved as though each step were a sum he had to calculate, and she knew him before anyone said his name, because the whole street arranged itself around him the way a yard arranges itself around the man who owns it. She understood that Pruitt was near the end of his life, and that he had built everything he had on a foundation he believed was buried under 30 years of rock and silence. She watched him hand himself up into his carriage. She did not approach him. There was no need. She had something better than a confrontation. She had a court date, and she had the rust, and she had 30 years of his own handwriting waiting in a box in a lean-to, in a town he had probably never troubled to learn the name of. The hearing was held in the territorial court in the spring of 1888. Clara was not the plaintiff, the heirs were, but she was the witness who mattered, because she was the one who had found the box and opened it and could testify to where the documents had been and the condition they were in. The unbroken rust, the sealed air, the 30 years of dust. all the things that proved the papers were what they claimed to be and had not been forged last week to ruin an old man. The courtroom was a plain plastered room with a stove gone cold and a row of windows that let in the spring light, and it was full because word of the case had run ahead of it, and the territory had a long memory for the names of men who had grown rich in the bad years. Clara wore the one good dress she owned and sat with her hands folded and waited her turn. And when it came, she walked to the chair and sat and answered what she was asked. She testified plainly. She did not embellish. When the lawyer for Pruitt's Bank suggested that a locksmith's daughter might have manufactured the documents herself, she explained, without heat, exactly how a lever lock rusted shut for 30 years differs from one freshly worked, and how the oxidation of iron records the passage of time as surely as rings record the age of a tree, and how any competent smith could confirm that the box had not been opened in decades before she opened it. The lawyer pressed her, asking whether a clever woman might not have aged the box on purpose, and Clara said that a person could no more counterfeit 30 years of rust than counterfeit 30 years of weather, and that he was welcome to bring any smith in the territory to swear otherwise, and the lawyer did not, because no honest one would. The recorder Hubbard testified to the genuineness of the old signatures against the territory's archives, comparing hand to hand for the court, with his spectacles low on his nose. And the documents testified for themselves, in Josiah Pruitt's own instructing hand. Pruitt did not come to court, he sent his lawyers, and his lawyers fought, and they lost, because there was nothing to fight with. The court found that the conveyances of 1858 and 1859 had been procured by fraud, and it set them aside, and it ordered restitution to the heirs from the estate of the bank that the fraud had built. Josiah Pruitt died that summer, before the final accounting, an old man whose name was being quietly cut out of the thing he had spent his life building. He was never confronted and never punished in any way the law calls punishment. He simply became, at the very end, what he had always in truth been, which was a man who had taken what was not his, and the truth of that outlived him by exactly as long as it took an honest hand to open a box. The restitution was not a fortune divided 11 ways, but it was not nothing. The court ordered the estate of the bank to account for what the fraud had taken, and to return its value to the heirs. And though the lawyers stretched the accounting as long as they could, in the end, the money came. The washing woman, Caleb Foss's granddaughter, received enough to stop taking in washing, and she used part of it to send Eli to school. The boy who had asked whether there was gold in the box and had been told there might be, and who had been more right than anyone. Ada Cruz, the blacksmith's widow, paid off the debt that had bent her shoulders for a decade, and bought back the forge her husband had built. The two brothers bought the deed to the land they had been renting, and the elder of them rode all the way to Salt Fork again, this time only to set a sack of his own coin on Clara's counter, and to be told gently that she would not take it and to leave it anyway when she turned to fetch a receipt, so that she found it after he had gone and could do nothing about it. The school teacher built a proper schoolhouse with a bell in a little tower. And Clara Mercer, who had found all of it and proven all of it and asked for none of it, took only the leather sack of gold coin that had lain on top of the papers, because Amos Wann's letter had said plainly that the coin was for the one who opened the box. And her father had taught her that the work was worth paying for, and that there was no shame in being paid for it. Honestly, it was not enough to make her rich. It was enough to buy a small shop in Salt Fork, with a counter and a back room, and a sign she had painted herself that did not say much. People brought her their jammed locks and their forgetful safes and the strong boxes that came down out of attics with the keys long lost, and she opened them, politely, and she charged a fair price, and in time the same town that had laughed at her $2 box brought her its hardest problems and called her by her name. Del Cargill never apologized because men like Cargill rarely do. One afternoon some years later, though, he brought her a strong box that had belonged to his late father, rusted shut, the key lost, and he set it on her counter and took off his hat, which from him was as near to an apology as the territory was likely to get, and he asked her almost gently whether she could open it. She told him she could. She told him it would take a little while, because the good ones always did, and that he was welcome to wait or to come back. He waited. He watched her hands, and when the lock gave, and the lid came up on whatever small thing his father had thought worth saving, he did not say anything clever, and neither did she, and that silence was its own kind of settling of accounts. Eli came back to Salt Fork a grown man with a teacher's certificate, and he taught at the schoolhouse the schoolteacher had built, and he used to bring his own students past Clara's shop and tell them, in a voice that tried not to sound proud and did not succeed, that the woman inside had once dragged a box out of a canyon that everyone said was empty, and had opened it, and had given a town back a piece of itself it never knew it had lost. Clara did not much care for the telling. She thought it made the thing sound grander than it was. To her, it had only ever been a lock, and a lock was only a question. And the trouble was that most people asked it rudely, and her father had taught her to ask it kindly, and the box had answered. On the wall of the shop, behind the counter, where she could see it from her workbench, she kept the roll of oiled leather with her father's picks in it, the slender steel, and the small brass wrench worn smooth by a dead man's thumb. She used them every working day. They were the most valuable thing she owned, and they were worth nothing at all to anyone but her, and that, she had come to understand, was the truest measure of what a thing is worth. Not what the world will pay for it, but what it lets an honest hand do. The picks lay in their leather, the lamp burned low. And outside, beyond the dark windows, the red canyon that everyone had called empty held a little less of its silence than it had before, because someone patient had finally gone up and asked.